Eleanor Vale slammed both palms flat on Gideon Cross's door so hard the hinges rattled. Her fingers were white, her lips were blue. 12 cents sat in her coat pocket. She'd counted them 4 times on the road just to feel like she still owned something. She wasn't begging. She needed that understood before the door even opened. She was offering a trade, and if he said no, she had already decided she would simply die on his front step rather than ask twice. If this story moved something in you, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has already traveled. Let's begin. The door opened 3 inches. That was all Gideon Cross gave her, 3 inches of lamplight and warm air and the smell of boiled potatoes, and Eleanor Vale took it like it was a banquet. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. Hadn't been able to feel them since she crossed the Pine Ridge 2 miles back, where the wind came down off the mountain in long flat sheets that hit you sideways and stole the breath right out of your chest. She'd kept walking anyway. You didn't stop walking in that kind of cold. You stopped walking and you didn't start again. "What do you want?" Gideon said. He was tall. She registered that first. Then the tiredness around his eyes, not the tiredness of a man who'd had a long day, but the tiredness of a man who'd had a long year and wasn't sure when it was going to stop being long. His shirt was rolled to the elbows despite the cold seeping through the open door. There was flour on his left forearm. He'd been cooking. Badly, she suspected, based on the smell that wasn't quite right coming from somewhere behind him. "Work," Eleanor said. He looked at her. Really looked the way people did when they were trying to figure out how much trouble was standing on their porch. She was used to that look. She'd been receiving it her whole life from people who took one look at the size of her, the breadth of her shoulders, and the fullness of her frame, and made immediate calculations about what she was worth. She kept her eyes steady. She had learned a long time ago that you could not afford to look away first. "I cook," she said. "I keep accounts. I organize supplies, manage distribution, and I can stretch a food store through a winter that would make most men panic. I've done it before." She paused. "I'm also standing here about to lose 2 toes to frostbite, so I'd appreciate if we move this conversation along." Gideon Cross stared at her for another long moment. Then he opened the door the rest of the way. "Come in," he said, "before you actually do lose the toes." The inside of the boarding house was warm and chaotic in the specific way that places get when someone competent has left, and no one adequate has replaced them. Eleanor saw it immediately, the stack of supply ledgers on the corner table with no discernible system. The meal rotation written on a chalkboard in 3 different hands. The pantry door hanging open, showing shelves that were organized by whoever reached them last, rather than by any logic. She saw a pot on the stove that was boiling too hard and would scorch the bottom in another 10 minutes. She walked to the stove and adjusted the flame without being asked. Gideon watched her do it. He didn't say anything. "You have 8 lodgers," she said, reading the register she'd spotted by the door. "2 of them are behind on payment. Your flour is down to what looks like maybe 3 weeks if you're not careful with portions, and your salt pork is going to freeze solid if whoever is responsible for the storage shed doesn't move it before tonight." She turned to look at him. "How long have you been trying to run this place alone?" "Since October," he said. "What happened in October?" Something crossed his face. It moved through quickly the way a cloud moves across the face of the sun. There one moment, gone the next, but you still felt the temperature drop. "My wife died," he said. She ran the kitchen. Eleanor didn't offer condolences. She had learned that condolences offered to strangers by strangers in the first breath of an introduction had a hollow ring that could feel worse than silence. She nodded instead. A real nod, one that acknowledged the weight of what he'd said without trying to lift it from him. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it, and let it sit there without decoration. "I've had 3 women try to take over the kitchen since then," Gideon said. He crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "None of them lasted a month." "What happened to them?" "Mrs. Hale from the church found a husband. Betsy Carver decided she preferred working at the general store. Clara Dowd—" He stopped. "Clara just didn't work out." Eleanor said nothing. She was already doing the math in her head. Flour stores, salt pork. 8 lodgers, 3 weeks of winter, still at minimum ahead, possibly 6 if the weather held the way these mountains tended to hold it. She was building a system in her mind, the way she always did, brick by brick, calculating before she committed. "I don't need a husband," she said. "I don't want to work at a general store, and I'm not Clara Dowd." She met his eyes. "I'm Eleanor Vale. I need a place to sleep 2 meals a day and a fair wage for my work. In exchange, your kitchen will run correctly, your accounts will balance, and your lodgers will eat well and stop giving you grief about it." She paused. "Do we have an arrangement?" Gideon Cross looked at her for a long time, long enough that she started counting the seconds, a habit she'd developed to keep herself from filling silence with nervous words. 1, 2, 3, 4. "The room is small," he said finally. "It's off the kitchen." "Small rooms are warm," Eleanor said. "I'll take it." Her first morning, she was up before anyone else. She didn't wake by accident. She set herself the way she always had. Some internal clock wound tight by years of knowing that the first person awake set the terms for the day. She had the stove going and water heating before the sun was fully over the ridge. By the time Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway, she had already found the problems. "Your supply ledger doesn't match your actual inventory," she said without turning around. She heard him stop walking. "Someone's been recording deliveries on arrival without confirming actual quantities. You're showing 3 crates of dried beans on paper, but there are 2 in the storage shed. Someone shorted you either on the delivery end or on this end, and I'd want to know which before I trusted either one again." Gideon came fully into the kitchen. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already made and stood looking at the ledger she'd spread across the table. "How do you know there are 2 crates in the shed?" "Because I went and counted them at 5 o'clock this morning." He looked up at her then. It was a different kind of look than the one on the porch the night before, less calculating, more considered. Like he was revising something he'd already decided. "And the salt pork," he said. "Moved it before dawn. It's packed in straw now and it'll keep." She turned back to the stove and began ladling out the morning porridge. "You also have a problem with the Calloway brothers in rooms 4 and 5. They're eating more than their arrangement accounts for, and someone's been letting it go without noting it. I'm not suggesting you throw them out, they're minors, and minors talk to other minors, and you want the mine camp recommending your house, not saying you're difficult. But they need to know the ledger is being kept accurately now." Gideon sat down slowly. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up again, the particular sound of it that meant more snow before evening. "Eleanor," he said. "Mr. Cross? How do you know all of this? The supply management, the ledger systems, where did you learn it?" She was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was one of those that came with a history she didn't intend to recite for a man she'd known for 14 hours. "I spent 12 years keeping accounts for a man who didn't deserve the business I built him," she said. "When I left, I took the knowledge with me. It was the only thing he didn't think to claim." Gideon didn't ask anything further. She respected him for that. The Calloway brothers, Tom and Ed, were not what Eleanor had expected. She'd anticipated pushback, the particular kind of resentful grumbling that men produce when a woman corrects something they've been getting away with. Instead, Tom Calloway just looked at the corrected ledger she set in front of him at dinner, looked at his brother and nodded with the air of a man accepting a verdict he'd known was coming. "Fair enough, Miss Vale," he said. "We'll settle the difference Friday when we get paid." "I appreciate that," she said, "and I want you both to know that as long as you're lodging here, you'll eat well. I don't skimp on the men who work hard in that mine. I just need the numbers, to be honest." Ed Calloway, the younger one, looked up at her with something that might have been surprise. "The last woman who kept this kitchen told Tom he was a thieving dog and threatened to pour his coffee on his head." "That sounds exhausting for everyone involved," Eleanor said. "Eat your supper." They laughed, both of them, and the tension that had been sitting over the table like a second ceiling just dissolved. That was how most of it worked, she had found. Not through force, not through confrontation sharper than the situation required, but through a kind of calm precision that made people feel that the right order of things was simply being restored. Most people responded to competence the way cold hands responded to heat. They didn't fight it, they leaned into it. But there were exceptions. Victor Hale arrived at the boarding house 3 days after Eleanor did. He arrived in the early afternoon when Gideon was out at the livery, and Eleanor was alone in the kitchen working through a full reorganization of the pantry shelves. She heard the front door open, and she heard a kind of footstep that was specific to a certain type of man. Heavy, deliberate, the footstep of someone who had decided in advance that wherever he was going, it was his space to occupy. "Hello," she called. "I'll be out in a moment." She came out carrying a jar of preserved summer corn she'd found behind 3 other things it had no business being behind. Hale was standing in the common room with his hat still on, a thing she noticed immediately because Gideon's house had a clear hook by the door, and taking your hat off indoors was not an optional courtesy. It was a matter of basic respect for the space, and he was looking at the bookkeeping register, the way a man looks at something he considers his property that has ended up in the wrong hands. He was perhaps 50, well-fed in the way that men with institutional money get well-fed, not the honest weight of physical labor, but the soft, settled weight of a man who ate at other people's expense. His coat was good. His boots were better. His eyes were the particular flat color of someone who was very accustomed to not being disagreed with. "Where's Cross?" he said. "Not here," Eleanor said. "I'm managing the house while he's out. Can I help you?" Hale looked at her. The look was thorough in the way she had also become accustomed to the quick inventory men took when they encountered her calculating size and taking from it certain conclusions about capacity and authority. She set the jar of corn down on the sideboard and kept her expression entirely neutral. "You're the new help," he said. "I'm Eleanor Vale," she said. "I manage the boarding house. You are—" "Victor Hale. I represent the Consolidated Mountain Mining Company." He said it the way people say things they expect to produce an immediate effect. "Cross has an outstanding balance with our supply arm, $17.40. I'm here to discuss terms of collection." Eleanor walked to the ledger table. She opened the accounts book, the reorganized one, the accurate one, and turned to the page she'd spent 2 evenings reconstructing from receipts and delivery records she'd found stuffed in a drawer. "The outstanding balance as of this household's records is $11.20, she said. "There's a discrepancy of $6.20 between your figure and ours. I'd be interested to understand where that discrepancy comes from before any payment discussion moves forward." Hale's expression didn't change. That was telling. Most people confronted with a factual discrepancy show some flicker of response: surprise, recalculation, even irritation. Hale showed nothing. That meant he already knew about the discrepancy, which meant the discrepancy was intentional. "These accounts are based on a woman's reading of figures," he said. "Mr. Cross should settle this matter directly." "Mr. Cross authorized me to manage accounts on behalf of this household," Eleanor said. "I'm happy to wait while you verify that with him, but the discrepancy will still be here when you get back." She paused. "As will I." Hale looked at her for a long moment. There was something working behind those flat eyes, a kind of recalculation, not a moral one, nothing that compassionate, a strategic one. "I'll return when Cross is present," he said. "That's your right," Eleanor said. "I'd encourage you to bring your own figures for the period in question. We can compare them against the delivery receipts which I've now organized by date." She said it pleasantly. Not with warmth exactly, but without hostility, either, the way you state a fact that has weight without needing you to throw it. Hale left. He didn't say goodbye. Eleanor stood at the window and watched him walk down the road toward the mine company office at the far end of Black Hollow's main stretch. She watched the way he walked that same deliberate proprietary stride, and she thought about $6.20. She thought about it the way she had learned to think about numbers when she worked for the man who didn't deserve her work, not as an abstraction, but as a fact with a story inside it. $6.20 added to 17 lodgers' accounts across the winter, added to every household in Black Hollow that owed the mining company anything, became a very different number. a number large enough to explain a coat that good and boots that better. She went back to the pantry. She had a great deal of work still to do. When Gideon came back from the livery that evening, she told him what had happened. She told it straight and without drama, the way she would have presented any account: the visitor, the figure, the discrepancy, her response, his departure. Gideon listened without interrupting. His face did not do what she expected. She had expected anger, the kind that flares when men discover that someone has been taking from them. Instead, he looked tired. Tired in a way that was different from the general tiredness she'd seen the first night. This was specific. This was the tiredness of a man who has been fighting the same battle for so long he's starting to forget why he began. "Hale's been collecting overages from half the families in Black Hollow," Gideon said quietly. He sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, the wind had arrived as promised, and she could hear it working against the shutters. People are afraid of him. The company has liens on most of the properties around here. You push back on a man like Hale, the company can make your life very difficult. "That's true," Eleanor said. She set a bowl of stew in front of him and sat across the table. "That's also true of most people who are doing what he's doing. They rely on the fear more than the actual power. The fear is the mechanism." Gideon looked at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that $6.20 doesn't seem like much," Eleanor said. "But if every household in this settlement has a similar discrepancy, and if the delivery records exist to prove it, and if those discrepancies can be demonstrated publicly in front of witnesses, Victor Hale's mechanism stops working." She folded her hands on the table. "I'd need to look at more than just this household's records. I'd need to see what others are carrying." Gideon was quiet for a long time. The wind pressed against the shutters. "Why?" he said finally. "You've been here 3 days. This isn't your fight." Eleanor considered the question honestly. It deserved an honest answer. "Because I have been in a situation," she said slowly, "where someone in authority was taking from me and everyone around me knew it, and no one said anything because they were afraid of what saying something cost. And I stayed quiet too, for longer than I should have." She met his eyes. "I'm not staying quiet again. And if someone here has the records to prove what Hale is doing, I would rather use them than walk past them." Gideon Cross looked at her across the table for a long, particular moment. Not the calculating look of the first night. Not the considered look of the morning after. Something else. Something quieter. "The Harmon family 2 doors down," he said at last. "Old Pete Harmon keeps every receipt he's ever received. Has since his wife taught him to 30 years ago. If there's a pattern, Pete will have it in paper." Eleanor nodded. "In the morning, then?" "In the morning," Gideon said. He didn't say thank you. She didn't need him to. The stew was hot, the wind was loud, and in the small room off the kitchen. For the first time in longer than she could easily count, Eleanor Vale felt something that was adjacent to belonging. Not safety, not yet, but the beginning of it. Pete Harmon opened his door on the second knock, which Eleanor took as a good sign. Men who answered doors quickly were men who weren't afraid of what was on the other side of them. He was somewhere past 70, with the particular wiriness of men who had spent their lives doing physical work and never quite stopped. His suspenders were fastened correctly. His eyes were sharp. He looked at Eleanor, looked at Gideon standing just behind her left shoulder, and said, "You're the new woman at the boarding house." "Eleanor Vale," she said. "I'd like to talk to you about your mining company accounts, Mr. Harmon, if you have the time." He studied her for a moment with those sharp eyes. Then he stepped back from the door. "I've got coffee on," he said. "Come in." Pete Harmon's receipts were not merely organized, they were catalogued. 30 years of his wife's careful instruction had produced a man who treated paper the way a surgeon treated instruments. Everything in its place, everything labeled, nothing misplaced. He brought 3 wooden boxes to the kitchen table and set them down without ceremony, and when Eleanor opened the first one and saw the neat dated bundles inside, something in her chest settled like a key finding a lock. "Your wife taught you this system," she said. "Martha kept the accounts for 22 years, Pete said. He poured coffee without asking if they wanted it. When she passed, I just kept doing it her way, Seemed like the least I could do. She went through his records for the past 18 months. Gideon sat across from her watching, saying nothing. Pete sat at the head of the table drinking his coffee with both hands wrapped around the mug, watching her the way people watch someone diffusing something delicate. She found the first discrepancy inside 10 minutes, then the second, then the third. "Mr. Harmon," she said, "in March you received a delivery of tool supplies from the company store. The receipt shows $42. What figure did Hale give you when he came to collect?" Pete set his mug down. $49. "And in July?" He said 61. "The receipt here says 54 and change." "And September?" Pete's jaw tightened, not with surprise, with the particular tightening of a man who has suspected something for a long time and is now watching the confirmation land on his own kitchen table. 68, he said quietly. "Receipt says 61 flat." Eleanor laid the 3 receipts in a row and set the corresponding collection figures written in Pete's own hand in a small notebook he'd kept because Martha had taught him to record everything, even verbal demands, beside them. She added the discrepancies in her head before she wrote them down. The numbers were not ambiguous. $7 across 3 transactions, she said. "From your household alone." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the snow had begun the kind that came in small, serious flakes that meant it intended to stay. "He's doing it to all of us," Pete said. It was not a question. "I believe so," Eleanor said. "But belief isn't the same as proof. The question is, how many households in Black Hollow have kept records the way you have?" Pete Harmon looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Eleanor. And then Pete Harmon put his coffee mug down, with a sound like a decision being made. "Ruth Albright keeps her accounts," he said. "So does Dan Marsh out on the east side. And the Kellerman family, though their English isn't always, they write things down in German and translate them after, so reading the system takes some patience." He paused. "How much proof do you need?" "Enough that a man with a company lawyer and institutional backing can't simply call it a misunderstanding," Eleanor said. "Enough that the pattern is undeniable." Pete nodded slowly. "Then I'm going with you to talk to Ruth." Ruth Albright was 40-something, broad-shouldered, and met them at her door with the expression of a woman who had been expecting bad news long enough that she'd grown tired of waiting for it to arrive. She had her records in a single ledger, not as thorough as Pete's system, but honest and consistent, maintained in the same hand from the first page to the last. Her discrepancy across 8 months came to $11.60. "I thought I was misremembering," Ruth said. She said it very quietly, the way people admit things they're ashamed of, even things that aren't their fault. "I thought I'd made an error somewhere." "You didn't," Eleanor said. "The error was made deliberately, and it wasn't yours." Ruth looked at the figures Eleanor had laid out beside her own ledger entries. The color moved through her face in stages: white, first, then something that was nearly red, then a kind of flat, resolute calm. "What do we do?" That was when Eleanor understood something she should perhaps have understood sooner. She had not come to Black Hollow to survive the winter. She had come to do exactly this, to find the place where the rot lived and bring a lamp to it. The cold road and the 12 cents and the frozen feet were not the beginning of a story about a woman who needed saving. They were the beginning of a story about a woman who had arrived exactly where she was needed. "We gather the documentation," Eleanor said. "All of it, from every household willing to participate, and then we present it publicly with witnesses so that it can't be quietly managed or dismissed." Dan Marsh, when they reached him, didn't say a word for a full minute after Eleanor laid out what they'd found. He just stood in the middle of his front room, looking at the figures with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated. Then he said, "My brother works the mine. If Hale figures out who came forward, the records speak for themselves," Eleanor said. "We're not accusing, we're presenting documentation. There's a difference, and that difference matters legally." Marsh looked at her. "You know law. I know enough to know that a company operating in a territorial settlement doesn't exist outside of legal accountability, regardless of how large it is or how many people here believe otherwise." She held his gaze. "And I know that a man collecting inflated debt across an entire community with paper evidence to prove it is exposed whether he wants to be or not. The question is only whether the people holding that evidence are willing to stand behind it together. The word together did something. She could see it move through him the same way it had moved through Ruth Albright, the same way it had produced Pete Harmon's decision to get up from his kitchen table and put his coat on. People who had been afraid in isolation were discovering that fear had a weakness. It shrank in company. Not disappeared. Shrank. "I've got records going back 14 months, Marsh said. "Give me 10 minutes. Gideon walked beside her on the road back to the boarding house that afternoon. They had been to 6 households. They had found discrepancies in all 6. The total overage across those accounts, across varying periods and transactions, came to just over $63. $63 extracted from 6 families in a settlement where $63 meant the difference between winter food stores and a January crisis. "You know what you've done today," Gideon said. He wasn't asking. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not quite wonder, but something near it. Something that recognized a thing it hadn't anticipated. "I've started something," Eleanor said. Starting something and finishing it aren't the same work. Hale has the company behind him. That's not nothing. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But a company operating through intimidation requires the intimidation to function. If it fails..." She stopped walking, turned to look at him directly. "When does the mine company make its quarterly collection? When do all the outstanding accounts get formally presented and settled?" Gideon thought about it. 3 weeks. First Friday of February. They hold it at the town hall, such as it is. Hale reads out the accounts in front of whoever's there. People pay, or they sign extensions. "In front of whoever's there," Eleanor repeated. Gideon looked at her. Then he looked away for a moment, at nothing in particular, the road, the snow still coming down the line of buildings that made up Black Hollow's main stretch. Then he looked back. "You want to do it publicly," he said, "during the collection meeting." "I want the discrepancies presented to Hale with witnesses present," Eleanor said, "so that there is no version of events that doesn't include the community knowing what the records show. He can call it an accounting error. He can claim misunderstanding. He can do whatever a man in his position does when he's caught. But he can't do any of it quietly, and he can't do it in a way that makes the people he's been overcharging feel alone." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Snow settled on the shoulders of his coat without him appearing to notice. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, Eleanor said. "I need to see the Kellerman records yet, and there are 2 more families on the west side Pete mentioned. I'd like to have every piece of paper organized and cross-referenced before we walk into that meeting." She started walking again. "And I'll need access to the company's own delivery manifests if any copies exist here in the settlement." "The general store," Gideon said, keeping pace beside her. "Silas at the general store receives a carbon copy of every delivery manifest from the company warehouse. It's standard he countersigns them for the settlement records." Eleanor stopped walking again. She looked at him. "Does Silas know what those manifests are worth right now?" "He doesn't know what we know." "Then he needs to," Eleanor said. "Tonight if possible." Gideon nodded. And then so quietly she almost missed it under the sound of the wind. "Eleanor." She looked at him. "What you did today..." He stopped, started again. "These people, they've been carrying this for months, some of them for over a year, and they just..." He shook his head. "You walked in and they just told you. Why?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered every question that deserved a serious answer. "Because I didn't walk in with a conclusion," she said. "I walked in with a question and their own paperwork. The conclusion was already there. I just held the lamp." Gideon Cross looked at her for a moment that went on long enough to have its own weight. Then he pulled his coat collar up against the snow and said, "We should talk to Silas before he closes up." They were halfway to the general store when the sound of hoofbeats behind them on the road made them both turn. The rider was moving fast for the conditions too fast, the urgency of it obvious, before the horse even slowed. It was Tom Calloway, her lodger from rooms 4 and 5, and his face when he pulled up beside them had that particular stripped quality of a man who has just received news he doesn't know how to contain. "Miss Vale," he said. He was looking at her, not Gideon. That too she noticed. "You need to know something. Ed just came up from the mine." He was breathing hard, either from the cold or from whatever he was about to say. "Hale was down there this morning. After he left your place the other day, he went to the mine foreman. He's—" Tom stopped, set his jaw, tried again. "He's putting word out that any mining family that's behind on company accounts needs to make full payment by end of February or face eviction from company-owned properties." He looked at Eleanor. 3 families in that category are living in company houses: the Leroys, the McCready family, old widow Fisher, who's been there 11 years. Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment. 3 families, eviction, end of February. 1 week before she'd planned to present the documentation at the quarterly collection meeting. It was a message. Hale didn't know what she had, but he knew she was looking. He was accelerating the timeline, applying pressure in the places where pressure would hurt people most, because men like Hale knew from long experience that community resistance dissolved fastest when individuals felt immediately personally threatened. It was a smart move. That was the thing she had to give him. It was a smart move. "How far behind are those 3 families?" she said. "Leroy owes around $22. McCready about $30. Widow Fisher." Tom's voice dropped slightly. "She owes $40. She's been making partial payments since her husband passed 2 winters ago. Hale's been accepting the partials all along. Now he's saying the full amount or they go." "The full amount," Eleanor said, "or what they actually owe after the overcharges are removed." Tom Calloway blinked. "What?" "The figures Hale is using," Eleanor said. "Are they the company's figures or the family's figures?" Tom stared at her. She could see the exact moment it landed, the way understanding crossed his face, like weather changing rapid and total. "You think he's inflating their balances too?" "I think it would be very surprising if he weren't," Eleanor said. "Tom, can you get word to the Leroys, the McCreadys, and Widow Fisher tonight? I need to see their records before morning." Tom Calloway looked at her. He looked at Gideon. And then he straightened in the saddle with the particular posture of a man who has just been given something useful to do with the anger he's been sitting on. "I'll have them at your door by 7 o'clock, he said. He turned the horse and rode back the way he came. Eleanor watched him go. Then she turned back toward the general store and started walking. "He's moved faster than I expected," Gideon said, keeping pace. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Does that change what you're planning?" She thought about Widow Fisher, who had been making partial payments for 2 winters without complaint. She thought about the Leroy and McCready families in company houses, which meant company houses could be emptied with far less legal friction than privately owned properties. She thought about the $63 already documented across 6 households and the additional records not yet collected, and the carbon copy delivery manifests at Silas's general store that no one had yet thought to compare against Hale's collection figures. "It changes the timeline," she said, "not the plan." She pushed open the door to the general store. "And it tells me something useful." "What's that?" Gideon said. "That he's afraid," Eleanor said. "Men who aren't afraid don't accelerate. They wait. They're comfortable." She stepped inside. Victor Hale is not comfortable. Silas at the general store was a thin, cautious man of about 60 who listened to what Eleanor laid out without interrupting, which she took as another good sign. When she finished, he was quiet for a full 30 seconds. Then he went to the back of the store and came out with a file box she recognized immediately as the kind of systematic record-keeping that serious, careful people maintained. "I countersign every manifest," he said. He set the box on the counter. "I keep my copies." He looked at Eleanor. "I always thought the figures seemed a little high. I never thought to compare them against—" He stopped. "I should have compared them." "You're comparing them now," Eleanor said. She spread his manifests across the counter alongside her own assembled records, and Gideon held the lamp while Silas read, and she wrote. And outside, The snow came down in the kind of committed, serious way that meant Black Hollow was going to wake up buried in the morning. And in the quiet of the general store, with the lamp burning between three people who had decided without announcement, without ceremony, simply by being present and working, that the way things had been was not the way things had to remain. Eleanor Vale built the case that was going to change everything. She did not think about whether she was brave enough. She had learned the long way that courage was not a feeling you waited for. It was a decision you made with cold hands and imperfect information and the company of people who had chosen to stand in the same place at the same time. She wrote down another figure, then another. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the snow kept falling. The 7 o'clock knock came at 6:45. Eleanor had the coffee already made and the table already cleared because she had not slept past 4, and by 5, she had reorganized everything Silas had given her the night before into a sequence that told a story anyone with 2 eyes and basic arithmetic could follow. She heard the knock, and she heard Gideon's footsteps crossing the front room to answer it, and then she heard voices, more than 3, more than she'd expected. And when she came out of the kitchen, she found not the Leroys and the McCreadys and Widow Fisher alone, but Tom and Ed Calloway standing behind them, and Pete Harmon beside them, and Ruth Albright and Dan Marsh, and 2 people she hadn't met yet, who turned out to be Henrik and Anna Kellerman, who had brought their records in a leather satchel, and whose English, as Pete had warned, required patience, but whose numbers required none at all, because numbers were the same in every language. 8 families. Standing in Gideon's front room at 6:45 in the morning because Tom Calloway had apparently not limited himself to the 3 families Eleanor had asked him to contact. She looked at Tom. He looked back at her without apology. "I figured more was better," he said. She couldn't argue with the logic. Widow Fisher was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, a compact woman in her late 60s, with white hair pinned so severely it looked structural, and eyes that were red at the rims in the way of someone who had been crying recently and had decided to be done with it. She held her account records against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something you're afraid of losing. Eleanor crossed the room to her directly. "Mrs. Fisher," she said, "I'm Eleanor Vale. Will you sit down with me and show me what you have?" The widow looked at her for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "He's going to put me out of that house. I've been there 11 years. My husband built the porch himself." "He is not going to put you out of that house," Eleanor said, not because she could guarantee it yet, but because the widow needed to hear something solid to stand on while they built the actual floor beneath her. "Sit down with me. Let's start with your records." What Widow Fisher had been paying, and what Victor Hale had been claiming she owed, turned out to be separated by a figure that made Eleanor set her pen down for a full 3 seconds before she trusted herself to speak calmly. $19.40. Across 2 years of partial payments faithfully made and meticulously recorded in a small notebook the widow had kept in her Bible. $19.40 had been added to her balance that had no basis in any delivery record, any supply manifest, or any agreement the woman had ever signed. $19.40, Eleanor said. Is that how much I still owe?" the widow asked. "No," Eleanor said. "That's how much he invented." She turned the notebook around so the widow could see the comparison, her own figures beside Silas's, manifests beside Hale's collection, demands laid out in a column so clean it was almost elegant. "Your actual balance based on the delivery records is $21.15, not $40. He added nearly half your supposed debt out of nothing." The room had gone very quiet. Eleanor hadn't realized until that moment how closely everyone was listening. $21, Widow Fisher said. She said it the way you say something when the saying of it is the first time the thing has felt real. I have that. I've had close to that for 3 months, but I thought he said 40, Eleanor said. He was wrong, deliberately wrong. Gideon spoke from across the room. His voice was controlled in the way that voices get when the control is doing a lot of work. How much is it across all 8 households? Eleanor had been running the total in the back of her mind since the Kellermans had shown her their satchel. She wrote it at the top of a clean page and turned it so the room could see. $112. Across 8 families. Extracted through falsified collection demands over periods ranging from 7 months to 2 years. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Pete Harmon said, "Lord Almighty." And then everybody started talking at once. Eleanor let it run for about 30 seconds. The anger, the disbelief, the specific stung quality of people discovering they have been deceived not once, but repeatedly over long periods by someone who counted on their isolation and their fear to make the deception sustainable. She let it run because it needed to run. You couldn't ask people to be strategic with feelings they hadn't been allowed to express yet. Then she said clearly, and without raising her voice above the level that made people stop to hear, "We have 3 weeks until the quarterly collection meeting. 3 weeks is enough time to do this right." The room settled. "Right meaning what exactly?" Dan Marsh said. "Right meaning we present this documentation at the meeting itself," Eleanor said. "In the town hall in front of every family in Black Hollow who comes to settle their accounts. We don't confront Hale privately. Private confrontation gives him room to manage it, to minimize it, to offer quiet adjustments that make individual families feel handled while the pattern disappears. We do it where everyone can see with documents that speak for themselves." She looked around the room. "Every household that's been overcharged needs to have their corrected figures ready. I'll prepare a master summary. Silas has agreed to present his manifests as the baseline since he countersigned them as the settlement's official record." She paused. "I will present the comparison." Ruth Albright said what Eleanor suspected several people were thinking. "You just got here 6 weeks ago. Why would they listen to you over the company's man?" It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. "They won't listen to me," Eleanor said. "They'll listen to the numbers. I'm just the one who's going to stand there and read them out loud." She met Ruth's eyes. "And you're going to be standing beside me, along with Pete and Silas and every family in this room, because a single woman with a ledger can be dismissed. A community standing together behind that ledger cannot." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. One firm, decided nod. The kind that didn't come back. Eleanor had 6 days of quiet preparation before Victor Hale appeared again. She used every hour. She organized the master summary with the kind of precision she'd learned from years of keeping accounts for a man who'd have used any error against her. No ambiguities, no rounded figures, every discrepancy sourced to a specific delivery manifest and a specific collection demand and a specific date. She worked at the kitchen table after the lodgers were fed and before they woke, and Gideon brought her coffee without being asked. And sometimes he sat across from her and helped her cross-reference figures from the second batch of manifests Silas had sent over, and they worked in a quiet that was comfortable in the particular way that quiet gets between 2 people who are doing something serious together and don't need to fill it. On the 3rd evening, Gideon said, "You worked like this when you were keeping accounts before, for that man you mentioned." "Every day," Eleanor said. "And he never—" Gideon paused. "He never acknowledged what you were building for him." It wasn't a question, but it wanted an answer. Eleanor set her pen down. "He acknowledged it the way some men acknowledge things that women build for them," she said. "By assuming it would always be there. By being very surprised when it wasn't." Gideon looked at the table for a moment. "His loss," he said finally, simply. "The way someone states a fact rather than offers a comfort." Eleanor picked her pen back up. "Yes," she said. "It was." The 4th day, Anna Kellerman came to the boarding house with a plate of rye bread and a second piece of information she'd apparently been uncertain about sharing, which was that her husband Henrik had overheard at the mine Victor Hale speaking with the foreman about what Hale had called the situation with the boarding house woman. The language of the conversation, as Henrik had reported it in German and Anna had translated, suggested that Hale was not alarmed by Eleanor, but was attempting to determine whether she had legal standing to challenge company accounts on behalf of third parties. "He thinks you might not have the right," Anna said carefully, "to present other families' records. He thinks maybe only they can do it themselves." Eleanor considered this. "He's not entirely wrong," she said. which is why every family needs to be present and willing to speak for their own records. I'm organizing and presenting. They're confirming." She looked at Anna. "Is your husband willing to stand up in that meeting and confirm your family's figures?" Anna smiled. It was a small, dry smile that carried a great deal behind it. "My husband," she said, "has wanted to say something to that man's face for 14 months. He will be there." The 5th day was the day Eleanor found the second ledger. She found it by accident, which was how the most significant things tended to find you. She was cross-referencing a set of supply manifests from the previous spring, and she noticed a reference number in Silas's records that didn't correspond to any delivery manifest she'd seen. She went back to Silas, who puzzled over it for several minutes before going to a different section of his file box and producing a set of records that turned out to be a separate account system the company had used during a specific 8-month period when Black Hollow had been served by a different supply contractor. The separate system showed deliveries that had been billed to settlement families twice, not overcharged, billed twice. The same delivery appearing in both the standard account and the contractor account with collection demands sent for both. Eleanor sat down on Silas's storeroom floor, which was not her most dignified moment, but the weight of what she was holding required a moment of pure physical response before she could be analytical about it again. "Silas?" she said from the floor. "How long have you had these?" "They came with the regular manifests," Silas said. He looked genuinely distressed. "I never cross-referenced them against the other system because they were a separate contractor. I thought they were separate accounts." "They are separate accounts for the same deliveries," Eleanor said. "Which means some families in this settlement may have been paying for the same supplies twice without knowing it." She stood up. "I need to go back through every family's records with this system in hand." "How much more are we talking?" Silas asked. Eleanor did a rapid preliminary calculation in her head, just the households she'd already documented. "Potentially another $60 to $80, she said. "Minimum." Silas sat down on a barrel of flour and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about his last year and a half. "Lord," he said softly. "I need one more day," Eleanor said, "and I need you not to say anything to anyone yet. If Hale hears that the documentation is larger, then he thinks he'll come at this harder before the meeting." Silas nodded. He looked shaken, but solid. The combination of those two things was in Eleanor's experience exactly what you wanted in a witness. She was back at the boarding house by late afternoon, the second ledger under her arm, and her mind already restructuring the master summary to incorporate the new figures when she found Victor Hale sitting in Gideon's common room. Not standing, sitting. In the chair nearest the fire with his hat still on his head, she noticed immediately, and an expression that was working very hard at being relaxed and not quite achieving it. Gideon was standing near the kitchen doorway. He looked at Eleanor when she came in. His expression was controlled, but his jaw had a set to it that she recognized by now as the particular tightness that appeared when he was angry and was choosing to be measured about it. "Miss Vale," Hale said. "I was hoping to speak with you." "Mr. Hale." She set the ledger on the side table without making anything of it. She sat down across from him without being invited to. "What can I do for you? I wanted to discuss," Hale said, "the situation you've been creating with the settlement families." He leaned back slightly. "I understand you've been going around asking questions about company accounts, collecting paperwork." His voice was pleasant. The pleasantness was a layer on something that was not pleasant at all. "I want to assure you, Miss Vale, that any discrepancies you may think you've found are the result of accounting transitions. The company moved between two contractor systems last year. The reconciliation of those accounts is ongoing." Eleanor looked at him. She kept her face entirely specifically neutral. "I appreciate you explaining that," she said. "That does clarify something I was puzzling over." Hale's eyes moved slightly. He'd expected pushback and had gotten agreement, and the unexpected agreement had produced a small, involuntary recalibration. "Good," he said. "Then perhaps it clarifies that the company is aware of the dual billing." Eleanor said. Which means the families who were billed twice weren't billed twice by accident. She held his gaze. That's a useful distinction to have on record. The room temperature changed. She could feel Gideon go very still in the doorway. Hale's pleasantness dropped approximately 1 degree, then another. He was a man accustomed to controlling the temperature of rooms he entered, and something had just happened that he hadn't arranged for and couldn't immediately reverse. "That's not what I said," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed, "but it is what the records show. 2 billing systems, same deliveries collection demands, sent for both during a period when you've now confirmed the company was aware of the transition." She tilted her head slightly. "That documentation is currently organized and cross-referenced by date, household, and delivery manifest number. I would be happy to present it to you privately before the collection meeting if you'd like to review it." Hale stood up. The pleasantness was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was neither angry nor afraid. It was calculating, the cold calculation of a man deciding whether the board position he's in is survivable or whether the game needs to change. "You're involving yourself in company business that doesn't concern you," he said. "The financial welfare of the families in this settlement concerns me," Eleanor said. She didn't stand up. She stayed seated, which meant he was standing over her, which was the position of apparent authority, and she was still the one holding the conversation. "And the documentation of what's occurred concerns me. And the meeting on the first Friday of February concerns me quite a bit." She looked up at him calmly. "I'll be there, Mr. Hale, with everything organized." Hale looked at her for a moment that had a great deal in it. Then he looked at Gideon. Then he walked to the door, opened it himself, and left without closing it behind him. Gideon crossed the room and closed it. He turned around. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the closed door. "He knows," Gideon said. "He knows that I know," Eleanor said. "He doesn't know exactly how much." She finally stood up. She picked up the second ledger from the side table. "Which gives us approximately 2.5 weeks to make sure that the answer to that question is everything." She went back to the kitchen table. She picked up her pen. And the work that was going to change Black Hollow continued quiet and precise and relentless in the warm kitchen of a boarding house on Ridge Road, while outside the winter dark came down hard and fast and absolute. 2 weeks before the collection meeting, Hale made his first real move. Eleanor found out through Ed Calloway, who heard it at the mine from the shift foreman who hadn't bothered to lower his voice when he told the crew that the company was bringing in an auditor from the regional office, not to review the company's own records, to review the settlement family's records. To determine, the foreman said, whether any of the households currently in dispute with the company had themselves been negligent in their accounting obligations. Ed had come straight from the mine to the boarding house without stopping to change out of his work clothes. He stood in the kitchen doorway with coal dust still on his face and said, "They're coming to audit us, to make it look like we're the ones who made the errors." Eleanor kept her pen moving for 2 more seconds, finished the number she was writing, then set the pen down. When? 10 days before the collection meeting. "Who's the auditor?" "Man named Greer, company man, from the regional office in Cheyenne." She thought about Greer before she'd ever met him. She thought about what a company auditor sent to discredit a community's records would look like, how he would operate, what he would need to make his version of events stick. He would need to find inconsistencies, errors in record keeping, gaps in documentation, anything that allowed the company to stand in that town hall meeting and say the family's figures were unreliable, and therefore the discrepancy was the product of confusion rather than fraud. He would find no inconsistencies. She had spent 3 weeks making certain of that. But the attempt itself was significant. It told her something she hadn't been sure of until now, that Hale had reported back to the regional office that the company knew what was coming, and that they were not going to simply absorb a public confrontation without fighting back. This was not a local problem anymore. This had the weight of institutional machinery behind it. She picked her pen back up. "Tell the families," she said. "Every household that's participating. Tell them an auditor is coming, and tell them not to hand over original documents to anyone before the meeting. Copies only. The originals stay with me." Ed nodded. Then he said, "Miss Vale, are we in trouble?" Eleanor looked at him. She gave him the honest answer because he'd earned it by writing straight from the mine to tell her what he'd heard. "We're in a harder position than we were this morning," she said. "We're not in trouble. There's a difference." She wasn't entirely sure she believed it yet, but she was going to work until she did. Gideon was in the front room when she came out, and from the set of his shoulders, she could tell he'd heard enough of the conversation to know the shape of it. He waited for her to speak first, which she'd come to understand was his way patient, not passive. The difference between those two things mattered enormously to her, and always had. "They're trying to flip the narrative," she said. "Make it about the family's record-keeping, rather than the company's billing practices. Put us on the defensive before the meeting even starts." "Can they do it?" Gideon said. "They can try," she said. "But an auditor from Cheyenne looking at Pete Harmon's 30 years of Martha-trained records or Silas's countersigned manifests is not going to find the ammunition they're hoping for." She paused. "The weakness isn't the documentation. The weakness is whether the families hold together when someone official comes knocking and applies pressure." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "The Leroys," he said. "Frank Leroy has been nervous since the beginning. His wife was the one who wanted to participate. He goes along with her, but He stopped. "He's the kind of man who backs down when something feels bigger than he expected." Eleanor nodded. She'd sensed it too, the particular quality of Frank Leroy's participation present, but unconvinced, willing, but not committed. A man who would fold, not out of dishonesty, but out of a fear so deep it had become its own kind of logic. "I need to talk to him before the auditor gets here," she said. "Not to persuade him, just to make sure he understands what walking away costs." "He won't respond well to pressure," Gideon said. "I'm not going to pressure him," Eleanor said. "I'm going to tell him the truth. The truth is enough if you tell it clearly." She went to the Leroy house the next morning. Frank Leroy opened the door himself and immediately had the expression of a man who had been expecting her and had been hoping the expectation was wrong. His wife Cora appeared behind his left shoulder within seconds, which told Eleanor the dynamic of the household with perfect clarity. "I know why you're here," Frank said. "Then I'll be brief," Eleanor said. "An auditor is coming from the company's regional office. His job is to find problems with your record-keeping so that the company can discredit your figures at the meeting. If you withdraw from the group presentation before he gets here, the company will take that as confirmation that your records don't hold up." She held his gaze. "If you stay, your records will be examined alongside 8 other households' records, all of which are consistent and documented. An auditor looking for individual error can't manufacture it when every account in the group tells the same story." Frank said nothing. His jaw was working slightly the way a man's jaw works when he's having an internal argument that hasn't resolved yet. Cora Leroy said from behind his shoulder, "Frank." Just his name. Nothing else. But the way she said it had the weight of everything they'd talked about at their own kitchen table in the nights Eleanor wasn't there to hear it. Frank Leroy let out a breath that had a lot of things in it. "What if the auditor comes in anyway and decides our records are wrong, regardless of what they actually show? Then we're no worse off than we are right now," Eleanor said. "Because right now, the company is claiming you owe $22 on inflated figures, and without the group presentation, that's what you'll pay, and nothing will change." She paused. "With the presentation, even if the auditor causes problems, the community has seen the documents. The story exists. That matters." Frank Leroy looked at his wife. Cora gave him the particular look that wives give husbands when they have already made the decision and are waiting for him to make it too. He turned back to Eleanor. "We'll stay in," he said. The auditor Greer arrived on a Wednesday. He was younger than Eleanor expected, mid-30s, well-dressed, in the specific way of professional men who want to be taken seriously, carrying a leather satchel, and the brisk confidence of someone who had done this kind of work before and found it straightforward. He had an office set up in the town hall for 3 days of review. On the first day, he reviewed Silas's manifests. Eleanor knew because Silas told her that evening in careful detail what Greer had asked and what Silas had shown him. He wanted the contractor transition record specifically, Silas said, the period where the two systems overlapped. What did you give him? Copies, Silas said. Like you told me, the originals are in your kitchen. What was his reaction when he looked at them? Silas paused. He didn't show much, but he spent longer on those pages than on anything else. And when he left, he walked very quickly. A man who walked very quickly after reviewing documents was a man who had found something he needed to report back about. That meant the documentation was having the right effect, or the wrong one depending on which side you were standing on. On the second day, Greer visited 5 households. Eleanor knew because Anna Kellerman sent her son with a note at noon, and Pete Harmon himself appeared at the boarding house at 3 in the afternoon to report directly. He was polite, Pete said. Very polite. Almost overly so. He went through my records carefully, and he asked good questions, knew what he was looking at. Martha would have respected the man's system, even if she'd have had no patience for his purpose. Pete sat down at the kitchen table. He found 2 entries where my date notations were inconsistent. February versus February, that kind of thing. He wrote those down. Eleanor felt a cold, specific clarity move through her. He's building a list of minor inconsistencies, she said. Individually meaningless, collectively intended to create an impression of unreliable record-keeping. Can he do that? He can try to present it that way, Eleanor said. But inconsistent date notation isn't an accounting error. It's a handwriting habit. She thought for a moment. Pete, I need you to write a 1-page statement, in your own words, describing your record-keeping system when you started it, and that it was established by your wife Martha 30 years ago and maintained consistently since. Personal testimony about the origin and method of a record-keeping system is not something an auditor can challenge on technical grounds. Pete looked at her. You want me to write about Martha? I want you to write about your records, Eleanor said. But yes, Martha is part of the record. Pete Harmon was quiet for a moment. His eyes did something brief and private. Then he said, I'll write it tonight. Greer came to the boarding house on the 3rd day. Eleanor had been expecting it. She had the copies ready, everything organized in the same clear sequence she'd prepared for the collection meeting, and she was sitting at the kitchen table when Gideon brought him in. She stood up when he entered, which was not deference, but positioning. She wanted to be on her feet for this conversation. Miss Vale, Greer said. He had a firm handshake and direct eye contact and the specific manner of a professional who had been trained to establish authority through form rather than force. I understand you've been the organizing party in this situation. I've been helping community members organize their existing records, Eleanor said. Would you like coffee, Mr. Greer? The offer put him slightly off balance, which was the intention. He accepted the coffee because refusing it would have been rude, and rudeness would cost him the posture he was trying to maintain. They sat down across from each other at the kitchen table like 2 people about to play chess. Both of them aware that was exactly what this was. He went through his questions methodically. She answered each one with the corresponding document. When he pointed to the date notation inconsistencies Pete had warned her about, she produced Pete's written statement, signed and dated, explaining the record-keeping system established by Martha Harmon and maintained for 3 decades. Greer read it. His expression didn't change, but he took longer than necessary to set it back down. The dual billing records, Greer said. The contractor transition period. You're aware that the company's position is that those were transitional accounting errors that have since been corrected. I'm aware that's the company's stated position, Eleanor said. I'm also aware that correction implies repayment to the families who were billed twice. I don't have documentation of those repayments having been made. She held his gaze. Do you? Greer said nothing for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time to be silent when you were trying to appear in control of a conversation. That would be a matter for the regional accounting office to clarify, he said. At the collection meeting, Eleanor said, I'll be asking for that clarification publicly, with the documentation on the table. She smiled, which she calculated carefully, not warm, not hostile, precisely professional. It would be very helpful if you could ensure someone from the regional office with authority to speak to that question is present. She watched Greer decide something. She could see the decision happen, not the content of it, not yet, but the fact of it. He was a professional doing a job, and some part of the professional doing the job had just encountered something he hadn't expected to encounter, which was documentation organized more thoroughly than the company had anticipated, presented by a woman who understood exactly what she had and exactly what it meant. He closed his satchel. He stood up. "Thank you for your time, Miss Vale," he said. "Thank you for yours," Eleanor said. "I'll see you at the meeting." He left. Gideon came in from the front room where he'd been giving them space, but staying close the way he did present, without intruding, available, without hovering. It was one of the things about him she'd noticed early, and continued to notice because it was not a common quality. "Well," Gideon said. "He's going to report back that the documentation is solid," Eleanor said. She sat down and picked up her pen. "Which means the company is going to make a decision before Friday. Either they concede something privately to try to prevent the public meeting from happening, or they come to the meeting prepared to fight." She thought about it. "I think they'll try to concede." "Why?" "Because a public meeting with those documents on the table is worse for the company than a private settlement. The story gets out regardless once it's public. A private settlement lets them control the narrative." She looked up at him. "If someone comes to you in the next 9 days with an offer, any offer, you send them to me first, before you say anything." Gideon nodded. He sat down across from her. He poured himself the last of the coffee and didn't speak for a moment, just sat with both hands around the mug in the way that meant he was thinking rather than just waiting. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "When this is over," he said, "what happens? You stay." "You." He stopped. Tried again more carefully, the way a man tries again when the first attempt revealed more than he meant to show. "The boarding house is running well. Better than it's run since." He didn't finish that sentence, but she heard the shape of it. "I'm not asking you to make a decision now. I just want to know if it's something you've thought about." She had thought about it. She had thought about it in the mornings before anyone else was up, while the stove was heating and the coffee was making and the ledgers were still closed on the table. She had thought about what belonging somewhere felt like versus what she had told herself belonging somewhere felt like for all the years she'd been in motion. She had thought about a man who brought coffee without being asked and held the lamp while she worked and said his loss, simply without decoration, about something he had no obligation to acknowledge at all. "I've thought about it," she said. She looked back down at her ledger. Gideon Cross looked at the side of her face for a moment. Then he looked at his coffee. She could feel him deciding not to push further, which was the right decision, and the fact that he made it told her something she filed carefully away. "I've got firewood to bring in before it gets dark," he said. "All right," she said. He got up. She kept writing. And in the 9 days remaining before the first Friday of February, Eleanor Vale did not waste a single hour, because she understood with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had lost everything once by trusting that things would simply work out, that the meeting was not the end of the fight. It was the moment the fight became visible. And visible fights, she had learned, were the only kind worth having. No one came with an offer. Eleanor had predicted they would try to settle privately, and she had been wrong. And she spent one careful hour on the Thursday before the meeting, examining why she'd been wrong before she set it aside, and focused on what the absence of an offer actually meant. It meant the company had decided to fight. It meant someone above Greer in the regional office had looked at the situation and concluded that conceding anything privately would establish a precedent more damaging than the public confrontation itself. It meant Victor Hale was walking into that meeting tomorrow with the full institutional weight of the Consolidated Mountain Mining Company behind him. She worked until midnight. Then she put the pen down, straightened every page of the master summary into its final order, and went to bed. Not because she was finished, but because she understood the particular danger of exhaustion before something important. the way tired minds start second-guessing work that was correctly done and find problems that don't exist and miss the problems that do. She needed to be sharp tomorrow. Everything else could wait. The town hall of Black Hollow was not a grand building. It was a large wooden room with benches on 3 sides and a central table that served as the official surface for whatever business was being conducted. And on the first Friday of February, it was fuller than Eleanor had ever seen it, which meant it was fuller than most people in Black Hollow had ever seen it. She knew because Pete Harmon told her when she arrived that word had spread through the settlement in the way that word spreads in small places when something significant is about to happen. Not through announcement, but through the particular quality of attention people pay when the air has a different charge than usual. Families she hadn't met came because families they knew were coming. Miners came because Tom and Ed Calloway had said something at the mine without saying everything. Silas had closed the general store for the morning, which in Black Hollow was the equivalent of hanging a sign that said something historic might occur. Eleanor set her documents on the community side of the central table. She set them neatly in order without ceremony. She stood behind them. Gideon stood to her left. He had not asked permission, and she had not suggested it. He was simply there, which was the only way he ever was decided without performance. Pete Harmon sat in the front bench with his boxes, Ruth Albright beside him, Dan Marsh, the Kellermans, the Calloways, Silas with his manifests, the Leroys, Cora with her chin up, Frank with his jaw set in the expression of a man who had made a decision and was going to stay with it. Widow Fisher in the center of the bench with her hands folded in her lap and her posture so straight it looked structural. Victor Hale arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. He brought 2 men with him, Greer, who Eleanor recognized, and a second man she didn't, older, heavier, with the bearing of someone who held actual authority rather than delegated it. Company lawyer, she concluded immediately, or regional director. Someone sent to apply weight. Hale looked at the room, and then he looked at Eleanor, and something moved briefly behind his flat eyes. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that the room was different from what he had planned for. The unnamed man sat down on the company side of the table. He introduced himself as Mr. Alderman, Regional Director for Consolidated Mountain Mining. His voice was the voice of a man who expected rooms to settle when he spoke, and to his credit, this one did. "We're here to conduct the quarterly account settlement for Black Hollow settlement families," Alderman said. "Standard procedure. Mr. Hale will read the outstanding balances. Families will confirm or present payment." He looked at Eleanor. "I understand there are some questions regarding account figures." "There are documented discrepancies," Eleanor said, "between the company's collection demands and the delivery records countersigned by this settlement's own general store operator." She did not say allegedly. She did not say we believe. She stated it as the fact it was. "I'd like to present those discrepancies before any account settlements are confirmed." Alderman looked at her for a moment. "And you are?" "Eleanor Vale. I manage the boarding house on Ridge Road, and I've been assisting community members in organizing their financial records." She paused one beat. "Mr. Silas, who countersigned your company's delivery manifests as the settlement's official representative, is present and prepared to speak to his records directly." Alderman's gaze moved to Silas. Silas met it without flinching, which Eleanor noted with quiet satisfaction. 3 weeks ago, Silas had sat on a flour barrel looking at the ceiling. Today, he was sitting straight-backed on a bench in the town hall with 30 years of countersigned manifests in a file box at his feet. "Proceed," Alderman said. She had practiced this. Not the words. She didn't need to practice the words because the words were the documents, and the documents spoke for themselves. What she had practiced was the pace. Calm, clear, unhurried. The pace of someone who is not defending, not attacking, simply illuminating. She started with the simplest discrepancy. The Harmon account. March delivery, $42 received, $49 demanded. She read the receipt figure. She read the collection demand. She read the difference. She set Pete Harmon's signed statement describing his record-keeping system on the table and slid it toward Alderman. "Mr. Harmon," she said without turning around, "can you confirm these are your records?" That is correct, Pete said from the bench. His voice was steady. Martha would have been pleased. She moved to the next household, then the next. Each time she read the figures, she set the corresponding document on the table, and each time she asked the family to confirm, they confirmed one by one in voices that started nervous and became steadier as the pattern made itself unmistakable. Hale sat very still. Greer was taking notes. Alderman's face had gone into a studied neutrality that was different from Hale's flatness, not the blankness of someone without conscience, but the careful control of someone who was doing rapid internal calculation. When she reached the contractor transition records, the dual billing, she paused for exactly 1 second, long enough to let the room feel the weight of what was coming. During a specific 8-month period, she said, the company transitioned between 2 supply contractors. During this transition, certain deliveries to settlement families were recorded in both billing systems and collection demands were sent for both. She laid the contractor manifests beside the standard manifests, the same deliveries visible in both. 3 households in this settlement paid twice for the same supplies. The combined overpayment from dual billing alone is $64.30. The room moved. Not loudly, it wasn't the noise of a crowd reacting. It was the specific sound of many people inhaling at approximately the same moment a collective breath that had something indignant in it. Hale said, those were transitional accounting errors. The regional office has been in the process of reconciling. Mr. Alderman, Eleanor said, turning her attention smoothly away from Hale and toward the man with actual authority. Can you confirm that repayments to the affected households for the dual billing period have been processed? Alderman said nothing for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was the answer. Those reconciliations, he said carefully, are ongoing. Ongoing meaning not yet completed, Eleanor said. Meaning the families in question have not been repaid. She set a single clean page on the table in front of him, the total, the full figure. Every discrepancy, every overpayment, every inflated demand organized by household and cross-referenced to its source document. The total documented overpayment across 11 households in this settlement, including dual billing, is $176.80. The room was completely silent. $176.80 was not an abstraction. In a settlement like Black Hollow, it was a winter's food for 3 families. It was a roof repair. It was the difference between a mortgage payment made and a property lost. Every person in that room understood exactly what that number meant in the physical terms of their own lives, and the silence it produced was the silence of people feeling something they'd suspected become something they knew. Victor Hale stood up. This is a misrepresentation of company records by a woman with no legal standing in these proceedings and no official authority to... Mr. Hale. Alderman's voice was quiet, and it stopped Hale completely, the quiet authority of a superior redirecting a subordinate. Sit down. Hale sat down. Alderman looked at the documents on the table. He looked at them for a long time. Eleanor watched him and did not speak, because this was the moment that did not require her. This was the moment where the documents spoke, and the man across the table had to decide what kind of man he was going to be in a room full of witnesses. Miss Vale, Alderman said finally, these figures you're prepared to attest to their accuracy. Every figure is sourced to a specific document present in this room, Eleanor said. Silas can confirm the manifests. Each family can confirm their own records. The documentation is complete and consistent across all 11 households. Alderman folded his hands on the table. He looked at Hale. Something passed between them that Eleanor couldn't read precisely but didn't need to. It had the quality of an ending, not a conversation. The company will suspend all current collection demands for settlement families pending a full internal review of the billing records for the period in question, Alderman said. He said it to the room, not just to Eleanor. Families will not be required to make payment at today's meeting. Any family that has been overcharged will receive a corrected account statement, and any overpayment will be applied as a credit against future balances. He paused. The dual billing discrepancies will be repaid directly. Cora Leroy made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing and was entirely human. Widow Fisher put one hand over her mouth. Just for a moment. Then she lowered it and sat up even straighter than before, which Eleanor would not have thought geometrically possible. Ruth Albright said flatly and with considerable satisfaction, "Well, it's about time." Hale said nothing. He was looking at the table in front of him, and his face had the particular closed quality of a man who understood that the room had just permanently rearranged around him, and there was nothing to be done about it. Alderman stood. He looked at Eleanor directly. "The company will be in contact with individual households through the general store operator rather than through Mr. Hale effective immediately." He picked up his copy of her summary. "May I keep this? I made it for you," Eleanor said. He nodded once. Then he picked up his satchel and walked out. Greer followed. Hale stood last, and when he moved toward the door, the room did something remarkable. Without coordinating it, people simply turned away. Not dramatically, not with hostility. They turned to each other, began talking, reached across benches. Hale walked through a room that had decided he was no longer the most significant thing in it, and the door closed behind him, and that was the end of Victor Hale's authority in Black Hollow. Pete Harmon appeared at Eleanor's elbow. He had his hat in both hands. His eyes were bright in the way of old men who have lived long enough to know that some moments don't come twice and are worth recognizing when they do. "Martha would have liked you," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "I would have liked Martha," she said. Pete nodded, put his hat back on, went to help Silas with his file boxes. The room slowly emptied out into the cold February air. People lingering in the way they did after something significant, reluctant to let the feeling fully disperse. Eleanor began gathering her documents from the table, organizing them back into their sequence. The habit of careful handling, too, ingrained to abandon just because the crisis was resolved. She heard Gideon's voice behind her. "Eleanor." She turned. He was standing a few feet away. He wasn't wearing his usual expression of measured, deliberate patience. He looked open, she thought, like a door that someone had finally decided to stop holding closed. "When you walked up to my door in December," he said, "I thought I was doing you a favor, letting you in." "You were," she said. "No." He shook his head, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more careful, and more real than a smile. "I was doing myself one. I just didn't know it yet." Eleanor held his gaze. Outside, she could hear the settlement sounds, voices, the creak of wagon wheels, someone calling across the road. The noise of a community that had just remembered it was one. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah, I've thought about it," she said. "What you asked, before the meeting." She kept her eyes on his. "I'd like to stay." He didn't say anything for a moment. The open look on his face became something that had no precise name: relief and gladness, and the quiet, solid weight of something settling into its right place after a long time of being uncertain where that place was. "Good," he said. Simply. The way he said everything that mattered. She turned back to the table and finished gathering her documents. He came to stand beside her and helped her straighten the last stack of pages. His large hands careful with the paper, and they worked side by side in the emptying room without needing to say anything further, because the important things had been said, and the rest was just the beginning of what came next. Black Hollow kept the memory of that February meeting, the way small communities keep the memories of the things that define them, not as story exactly, but as fact, woven into the fabric of how people understood themselves and each other. The company sent corrected account statements within 3 weeks. The dual billing repayments came in April. Widow Fisher paid her actual balance and kept her porch, the one her husband had built, and planted flowers along it when the ground finally thawed. And Eleanor Vale, who had arrived on a December night with 12 cents and frozen feet and a spine like iron, remained in Black Hollow. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had built something here worth staying for, and because a quiet, tired man had opened his door 3 inches, and then reconsidering the rest of the way. She had not needed rescuing. She had needed room. And room in the end was the one thing Black Hollow had given her in abundance.